Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. Sometimes I walk past the bedroom and the sheets are different, wrinkled in places I didn't touch, corners untucked. It's subtle but consistent. I started smoothing everything with precision before leaving. The next time I came back, the center had sunk just enough to suggest weight. I placed objects around the bed, small things, keys, a pen, a single coin. The next morning, 2 had fallen, as if something had shifted, rolled, stretched. Now I avoid looking directly at it from the hallway, but I always hear the faint groan of springs when I enter the room, even if I left it empty. The first time I noticed, I convinced myself it was nothing. Old houses settle, fabric shifts, springs compress and expand with temperature changes. But the pattern became too deliberate to dismiss. The indentation always appeared in the same spot, center left, where someone might naturally curl up. The depth consistent, as if the same weight pressed down repeatedly. I began documenting everything. Photographs before and after, measurements of the wrinkles, the way the pillow held its shape long after I'd fluffed it smooth. My notebook filled with observations that seemed increasingly absurd when written down, yet undeniable when witnessed. The bed breathed without me on it. The smell came next. Faint at first, like fabric softener mixed with something warmer. Human, but not quite right. Too clean, too controlled. It lingered strongest near the headboard, where the wood met the wall. I pressed my nose against the grain, inhaling deeply. The scent intensified, becoming almost medicinal. Antiseptic. The kind of smell that clings to hospital corridors and funeral homes. I started leaving the bedroom door open, positioning myself in the hallway where I could watch without being seen. The waiting felt endless. My eyes strained against the dim light filtering through the curtains. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. But the moment I looked away, even for seconds, the sheets would shift. A wrinkle appeared. A corner loosened. The impression deepened. My phone camera captured nothing unusual. The audio recorder picked up only the house's normal sounds, creaking floors, settling walls, the hum of electricity through old wiring. But when I played the recordings back, there was something underneath. A rhythm, slow and steady, like breathing, like a heartbeat against cotton. I moved the bed away from the wall, searching for explanations. Pipes, wiring, anything mechanical that could cause movement. The wall was solid, unremarkable. But when I pushed the bed back into place, the metal frame scraped against something. A groove in the floor, worn smooth and deep, as if the bed had been sliding back and forth for years. The temperature changes started gradually. The mattress felt cooler on one side, warmer on the other. I placed my hand on the cool spot and felt it slowly warm under my palm. The fabric seemed to pulse, like skin responding to touch. I jerked my hand away, but the warmth followed my fingers, clung to them. My skin felt strange for hours afterward, as if something had been absorbed. I bought new sheets, heavier fabric, tighter weave. The disturbances continued. The new material showed impressions even more clearly, holding the shape of whatever pressed against it. I tried sleeping on the couch, keeping the bedroom door locked. But I could hear the springs through the wall. Soft creaks, gentle sighs, the rhythm of someone turning in their sleep. The reflection in the mirror above the dresser began changing. Not dramatically, just subtle shifts in the way light caught the glass. Sometimes the bed looked fuller than it should. The blanket raised slightly, as if covering something. I started avoiding the mirror, but peripheral vision caught the movements anyway. The gentle rise and fall of fabric, the way shadows pooled in spaces that should be empty. I called a friend, asked them to stay overnight. They slept in the guest room while I took the couch. In the morning, they mentioned hearing movement from the master bedroom. Footsteps, the sound of someone getting in and out of bed. When I checked, the sheets were more disturbed than ever. The impression deeper, more defined. Almost like someone had been tossing and turning all night. My friend suggested a doctor. Stress, overwork, sleep deprivation causing hallucinations. But the evidence was physical, tangible. The bed moved whether I was conscious or not, whether I was home or away. I started taking pictures every few hours, creating a timeline of disturbances. The pattern became clear. The activity increased when I paid attention to it, as if awareness fed whatever was happening. I tried sleeping in the bed again, determined to confront whatever shared the space. The mattress felt different under my weight, softer on one side, firmer on the other, like it was accommodating two bodies instead of one. I lay perfectly still, listening. The springs creaked occasionally, but not from my movement. The sound came from beside me. Small adjustments. gentle shifts. The breathing rhythm I'd heard in recordings became audible without electronics. When I rolled over, the mattress dipped slightly in the empty space, not from my motion, but in response to it, as if something was adjusting to accommodate my new position. I reached out slowly, expecting to touch nothing. My hand met resistance, not solid but present, like touching water or thick air. The sensation was warm, yielding, familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. I turned on the light. The bed looked normal, empty except for me, but my hand still felt the impression of contact. The warmth spread up my arm, settling in my chest like recognition, like memory. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound from the bedroom felt like an invitation, a request, a demand. The next morning, I found my pillow in the center of the bed, perfectly positioned, the way someone might arrange it for another person. The sheets were tucked with hospital corners, neat and precise, too perfect for my clumsy attempts at bed making. I never learned to fold corners like that, but someone had, someone who cared about getting it right. I pack my things now, preparing to leave, but the bed looks comfortable, inviting. The impression in the mattress seems deeper, more defined, like it's been waiting patiently for me to return. The springs creak softly as I move around the room, a gentle greeting, a welcome home. The smell is stronger now, less antiseptic, more personal, more mine. I know I should go. The rational part of my mind screams warnings, but the bed looks so comfortable, so ready. The sheets are turned down slightly, the way someone might prepare for a guest, for a partner, for someone who belongs there. The impression fits my body perfectly now, like it was made for me, like it's been waiting all along. My suitcase sits by the door, but my feet won't carry me past the threshold. The bed calls without words, promises rest, promises company, promises an end to the mystery that's consumed my thoughts for so long. I know if I lie down now, I'll understand everything. The movement, the warmth, the presence that shares my space. But I also know I'll never get up again. Story 2. The room feels normal until I sit down. That's when the air shifts just barely and the scent slips in. Not strong, not unbearable, just wrong. Overripe, almost sweet, with something foul behind it. I searched for the source. Nothing. Checked vents, drains, even under the floorboards. Still nothing. But The scent always returns when I let my guard down, when I stop thinking about it. It coils into the back of my throat like memory. I've started waking up with it in my mouth, like something left it there while I slept, like it wants me to taste it. The first week, I convinced myself it was logical. Old pipes, rotting wood, maybe a dead animal in the walls. I called a contractor, had the place inspected. He found nothing unusual. Clean air quality, no moisture problems, no signs of decay. But he kept wrinkling his nose while he worked, asking if I smelled something sweet. I lied and said no. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind. After he left, I started documenting everything. I wrote down when the scent appeared, how long it lasted, what I was doing when it started. The pattern made no sense. Sometimes during meals, sometimes while reading, sometimes in the middle of conversations on the phone. The only constant was my chair, that old leather armchair where I spend most of my evenings. The scent never came when I was standing, never when I was in other rooms, only when I settled into that familiar comfort. I began recording with my phone, thinking maybe I could capture something, some sound that accompanied the smell. The recordings were always clean, just my breathing and the soft creak of the chair. But when I played them back, there was something else. A whisper of static, so faint I had to strain to hear it. It sounded almost like breathing, but not quite. More like air being pulled through something wet. The smell started changing, growing stronger, more complex. Now I could detect layers. The sweetness of overripe fruit, yes, but underneath, something metallic. Something that reminded me of the taste of blood when you bite your tongue. I started avoiding the chair, spending evenings on the couch instead. But the scent followed me there too, lighter but persistent, like it was learning to adapt. I researched phantom smells, olfactory hallucinations, neurological disorders. The medical websites were full of explanations: stress, medication side effects, brain tumors. I made an appointment with a doctor. The tests came back normal. Brain scans showed nothing unusual. Blood work was perfect. The doctor suggested it might be psychological, recommended rest, and stress management. But I knew this wasn't in my head. I could taste it getting stronger. The recording sessions became obsessive. I set up multiple devices around the room, hoping to catch whatever was causing this. The audio files revealed more of that strange static, and sometimes, buried deep in the background, what sounded like whispers. I ran the files through audio software, isolating frequencies, amplifying the quiet sounds. whispers became clearer, but they weren't words in any language I recognized. They were wet, urgent, almost pleading. One evening, the scent hit me so hard I gagged. It was no longer just rotting fruit. It was decay, pure and overwhelming. I stumbled out of the chair, but instead of dissipating, the smell seemed to cling to me. I could feel it in my hair, on my clothes, seeping into my skin. I showered for an hour, scrubbing until my skin was raw, but the smell remained. It was becoming part of me. The reflections in the windows started changing. At first, I thought it was just the lighting, the way evening shadows fall across glass. But when I looked directly at my reflection, something was off. The image seemed delayed, lagging behind my movements by just a fraction of a second. When I raised my hand, my reflection followed a heartbeat later. When I turned away, I could swear I saw it continue moving in my peripheral vision. I started sleeping in other rooms, but the scent found me everywhere. It was strongest in the bedroom now, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. I pressed my ear against the plaster, listening for signs of decay behind it. The wall was warm against my cheek, and I could feel a subtle vibration, like a slow, steady pulse. The smell was so strong I could barely breathe. The breaking point came when I found the fruit. Not real fruit, something else entirely. In the corner of the room where the scent seemed strongest, the air itself looked different. Thicker, more viscous, with a shimmer like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. As I watched, transfixed, shapes began to form in that distorted air. Bulbous, organic forms that pulsed with their own rhythm. They looked like fruit, but wrong, too soft, too dark, leaking something that wasn't juice. I reached out to touch one of the shapes, and my hand passed through empty air. But I felt something, a wetness, a texture like overripe flesh giving way under pressure. The smell exploded around me, so intense I fell to my knees. The shapes in the air grew more solid, more defined. I could see them breathing, expanding and contracting like lungs. The whispers from my recordings filled the room, no longer coming from electronic devices, but from the shapes themselves. I ran, left the house that night, and didn't return for days. But the scent followed me. It was in my car, in hotel rooms, in restaurants. Other people started noticing it too. Friends would wrinkle their noses when I approached. Servers would ask if something was spoiled. I realized I was carrying it with me, that somehow it had become part of my scent profile. When I finally returned home, the shapes were gone. The air looked normal, reflections in the windows behaved properly. But the smell remained, fainter now, but permanent. I can taste it on my tongue when I wake up, smell it in my hair after every shower. It's become my baseline, my new normal. The recordings I made are still on my phone, but they've changed. The whispers are clearer now, more insistent. Sometimes I play them back, and I can almost understand what they're saying. Almost. They sound like they're trying to tell me something important, something I need to know. But every time I get close to comprehending, the meaning slips away like fruit juice through my fingers. The chair sits empty now. I can't bring myself to sit in it again, but I can't throw it away either. Sometimes I catch movement in my peripheral vision, as if someone is sitting there, breathing slowly, waiting. The leather looks different now, darker, with a wet sheen that wasn't there before. When I pass by, I can feel its pull, like it's calling me back to where this all began. I've accepted that the scent is part of me now. It's changing me, becoming something new. I can feel it in my bloodstream, in my breath, in the way my reflection moves just slightly out of sync with my body. Whatever those shapes were, whatever spoke to me through the static, it's still here, still growing, still waiting for me to understand what it's trying to tell me. And I'm starting to listen. Story 3. I measured, remeasured, used a level, a square, even marked the floor. The door frame shifts slightly each week, barely noticeable, but the door still fits, like it's following the change, like it's accommodating. Now the hinges creak in a strange rhythm, and I swear the space at the top of the frame narrows each night. I tried filming it. The video shows nothing wrong, but the footage feels tilted, like the angles have turned in on themselves. When I pass through the doorway, I sometimes feel taller, shorter, or just different, as if the door has decided what version of me should come out. The scent of cedar filled the air when I first noticed it. Strange, since my apartment is all drywall and synthetic materials. The wood smell seemed to emanate from the doorframe itself, stronger when I pressed my face close to the painted surface. I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling for gaps or warping. The wood felt warm, almost breathing under my touch. I started keeping a journal, marking measurements each morning. The frame tilted exactly 1 degree every 7 days. The door adjusted perfectly, never scraping or sticking. I documented everything. The cedar scent that came and went, the way shadows fell differently across the threshold, the the subtle vibration I felt when touching the frame. My neighbor knocked one morning, asking if I'd been renovating. She mentioned hearing drilling sounds, rhythmic and persistent. I hadn't touched any tools in weeks, but when I listened carefully, I could hear it too, a faint scratching from within the walls, like something burrowing through the wooden frame. The door began to resist me. Not obviously, but I'd push and feel a slight pushback, as if someone on the other side was testing my strength. I'd pull the handle and sense hesitation, a moment where the door seemed to consider whether to open. When it finally yielded, the cedar scent would rush out, mixed with something else, something organic and unfamiliar. I set up a camera to record continuously. The footage showed nothing unusual, but watching it made my eyes water. The angles looked wrong, as if the lens was capturing dimensions that didn't quite fit together. I played it back in slow motion, frame by frame, searching for the moment when everything shifted. The door appeared stationary, but the space around it seemed to breathe. The scratching grew louder. I pressed my ear to the frame and heard voices, whispered conversations in a language I couldn't identify. The words felt familiar, like something I'd known once but forgotten. I tried recording the sounds, but the playback only captured silence. Yet I could still hear them, clearer now, discussing measurements and adjustments. One evening, I found sawdust on the floor, fine, cedar-scented powder that hadn't been there before. I swept it up, but more appeared the next morning. The frame was reshaping itself, I realized, carving new angles, adjusting its geometry to accommodate something I couldn't see. I measured myself passing through the doorway. My height changed each time, sometimes by inches, sometimes by fractions so small I questioned my own perception. I felt compressed walking through, as if the frame was squeezing me into a different shape. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked subtly altered. My shoulders narrower, my face longer, my eyes set deeper. The door started opening by itself, not swinging open, but gradually easing ajar, as if someone was slowly turning the handle. I'd close it firmly, only to find it slightly open again. The gap was always the same width, perfectly calculated to let something specific pass through. I tried barricading it, pushing furniture against the frame. The cedar scent intensified, and the scratching became urgent, almost frantic. The barricade didn't move, but I could feel pressure building behind the door, like air being compressed in a sealed chamber. When I finally removed the obstacles, the door swung open with a soft sigh. The voices became clearer. They were discussing me, I realized, analyzing my measurements, my habits, my patterns of movement. They spoke of adjustments needed, modifications to be made. I was the variable they were accommodating, the element they were trying to fit into their carefully calculated space. I decided to leave, packed my essentials, and headed for the door one last time. As I reached for the handle, I felt the frame shift around me. The space contracted, the angles closing in. I was halfway through when I realized I was stuck, not physically, but dimensionally. The doorway had molded itself to my exact specifications, creating a perfect fit that wouldn't let me pass. The cedar scent was overwhelming now. I could feel the wood pressing against my skin, warm and alive. The scratching sounds surrounded me, coming from every direction. The voices were discussing the final adjustments, the last modifications needed to complete their work. I pulled back into the apartment, gasping. The door closed with a soft click. In the mirror, my reflection looked exactly as it always had, but something was different. The frame behind me in the glass showed no irregularities, no tilt, no signs of the changes I'd documented so carefully. I live with it now. The door frame that knows me too well, that shapes itself to my presence. I've stopped measuring, stopped documenting. The journal sits abandoned on my desk, its pages filled with measurements that no longer match reality. The cedar scent has faded, replaced by something else, something that smells like me, but not quite. Sometimes I catch glimpses of others who have passed through, their shapes pressed into the wood grain, their measurements carved into the frame's memory. We're all here, in a way, cataloged and stored, our dimensions preserved in the living geometry of this threshold. The door still fits perfectly. It always will, because it's not just a door anymore. It's a collection of everyone who's passed through it, an archive of human measurements and movements. And I'm part of that collection now, my shape permanently etched into its wooden memory. When visitors come, they comment on how perfectly the door fits its frame. They admire the craftsmanship, the precise angles. They don't notice how the frame shifts slightly as they approach, adjusting itself to accommodate their measurements. They don't smell the cedar, don't hear the scratching, don't feel the wood reaching out to learn their dimensions. But I do. I watch as the frame studies each new person, memorizing their shape, their gait, their presence. I see the subtle adjustments, the careful calibrations. And I know that somewhere in the wood's memory, I'm still there, measured, cataloged, and perfectly fitted into a space that was never meant for me. The door frame isn't aligned with the door. It's aligned with us. Story 4. I know it's off. I pulled the plug myself. But some nights the hum returns, low and steady, as if the machine is alive and breathing through plastic lungs. I checked the cord again. Still out, no power. Yet the vents vibrate and cold air flows, not quite artificial, not quite natural. It carries a scent I can't place, one I haven't smelled since childhood, maybe earlier. I've tried moving it to a different room. The hum follows. The machine is quiet during the day, but at night, I swear I hear it speaking in slow, mechanical sighs, and something behind it answering. The apartment came furnished. The unit was already mounted on the wall when I moved in. A boxy white thing with yellowed plastic and a control panel that clicked when pressed. The landlord mentioned it had been there for years, maybe decades. I never questioned it. Air conditioners are supposed to be invisible, functional, forgettable. But this one demanded attention. The first night, I woke to the familiar drone of cooling machinery. Half asleep, I reached for the remote, fumbling in the darkness. The display showed nothing. No green light, no temperature reading. I stumbled to the wall and felt for the plug. My fingers found empty space where the cord should connect to the outlet. I stood there, barefoot on cold linoleum, listening to the impossible sound. The hum wasn't quite mechanical. It had a rhythm like breathing, like something massive inhaling and exhaling through metal tubes. The air flowing from the vents felt different too, not the sharp, chemical cold of refrigeration, but something deeper, older. It reminded me of root cellars and forgotten basements, places where the earth itself seemed to exhale. I plugged it back in, assuming I'd been mistaken. The hum stopped immediately. The sudden silence felt wrong, like interrupting a conversation. The next morning, I examined the unit closely. Standard model, nothing unusual. The serial number had been scratched away, leaving only faint marks in the plastic. The filter looked clean, recently changed. I pressed my ear to the metal housing and heard nothing but the normal settling sounds of old machinery. That evening, I made a point of watching the plug. I sat in the chair across from the outlet, book in hand, glancing up every few minutes. The cord remained connected. The unit stayed silent. I felt foolish for doubting my own memory, but as the room grew darker, as the sounds of the building settled into night rhythms, I began to notice other things. The way shadows fell differently around the air conditioner, how the wall behind it seemed to pulse slightly, as if something large was breathing just beyond the plaster. The scent was stronger now, not unpleasant, but unsettling. Like flowers left too long in water, or the air before a storm. I decided to document everything. I started a notebook, recording observations, sketching the unit's position, noting when the phenomena occurred. The writing helped me feel in control, scientific. I was gathering evidence, building a case. The pattern became clear after a week. The hum only started after I fell asleep. It would wake me, and I'd find the plug pulled from the wall, the cord lying on the floor like a dead snake. But the machine would still be running. The air would still be flowing, and that scent would fill the room until I could taste it on my tongue. I bought a small recorder and placed it near the unit. The next morning, I played back the night's audio. For hours, nothing but the ambient sounds of the building. Then, around what must have been midnight, a new sound emerged. Not the hum I'd been hearing, but something else. Whispers. Voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize, their words distorted by the machine's metal throat. The voices weren't speaking to me. They were talking to each other, carrying on conversations through the vents. Sometimes they sounded urgent, sometimes patient, always distant, as if coming from very far away. I tried different things. I sealed the vents with tape, but the voices found other ways through, seeping from the gaps around the unit's edges, vibrating through the wall itself. I moved the recorder to different positions, but the quality never improved. The voices remained just beyond understanding, tantalizingly close to meaning. The temperature in the room began to change. Not just cold, but specifically cold. The kind of cold that exists in places where warmth has been actively removed, where something has been feeding on heat itself. I started wearing sweaters to bed, then jackets. My breath began to mist when I sat near the unit. I called the landlord. He seemed confused by my description, asked if I'd tried adjusting the thermostat. When I explained that the unit operated without power, he laughed and suggested I might be dreaming. He offered to send a repair technician, but something in his voice suggested he wouldn't. The voices grew clearer, not the words themselves, but their emotional content. They were discussing me. I could hear my name, not spoken, but somehow present in the rhythm of their speech. They knew I was listening. They approved. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. I moved to the couch, then to the kitchen floor, but the sound followed me. The entire apartment had become a resonating chamber for whatever was speaking through the machine. The walls themselves seemed to carry the voices, and the scent grew stronger throughout the space. The unit began to leak. Not water, but something thicker. A clear fluid that pooled on the floor and evaporated without leaving stains. When I touched it, my fingers went numb. The numbness spread up my arm and lingered for hours. I tried to remove the unit from the wall. The screws wouldn't turn. They felt welded in place, as if the machine had grown into the building itself. I pulled at the housing, but it didn't budge. The wall around it had become part of the machine, or the machine had become part of the wall. The voices were constant now. Day and night, they filled the space with their incomprehensible conversations. Sometimes they seemed to be giving instructions. Sometimes they sounded like prayers. Always, they carried that tone of patient expectation, as if they were waiting for something to happen. I realized the scent wasn't coming from the machine. It was coming from me. My skin had absorbed it, and now I carried it wherever I went. People on the street would turn and look when I passed, their faces showing confusion, as if they'd smelled something that reminded them of a dream they couldn't quite remember. The cold had settled into my bones. I couldn't get warm anymore. No matter what I wore or how high I set the heat. The apartment felt like a refrigerator, but one that was cooling something other than air. Something invisible and vital was being slowly extracted from the space and from me. I found myself standing in front of the unit for long periods, listening to the voices, trying to understand their purpose. They seemed to be teaching me something, preparing me for something. The conversations had become rhythmic, hypnotic. Sometimes I would lose track of time and find myself hours later, still standing there, my skin pale and my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The machine wasn't just running anymore. It was transforming. The plastic housing had developed a translucent quality, and I could see shapes moving inside. Not mechanical parts, but something organic. Something that pulsed with its own rhythm, independent of any electrical current. I don't sleep anymore. The voices have become my constant companions, and I've begun to understand fragments of their speech. They're not speaking to each other. They're speaking to something else, something that's been listening through the machine all along. Something that's been waiting for the right conditions, the right temperature, the right scent to fill the air. The apartment is ready now. I am ready now. The machine runs constantly, cooling the space to exactly the right temperature. The voices have grown quiet, expectant. The scent has become part of the air itself, indistinguishable from the atmosphere. I know what's coming. The machine was never broken. It was never really an air conditioner at all. It was always a door, and now it's finally opening. The cold isn't leaving the room anymore. It's entering from somewhere else, bringing with it the breath of spaces that exist between the walls of reality. The plug lies on the floor, has been there for weeks now. But the machine keeps running, keeps cooling, keeps calling to whatever waits on the other side of the electric hum. And I remain here, in this perfect temperature, breathing air that tastes of distant places, listening to voices that have finally found their way home. Story 5. It's dry when I leave, clean, shiny. But when I return, there's water in it, just enough to cover the drain. Still, unmoving, almost reflective. I live alone. No leaks. I tested the faucet. Nothing. I poured it out and dried everything. Came back hours later. There it was again. And sometimes, when I look into the water, it doesn't show my ceiling. It shows something darker, like it's reflecting a space that exists just beneath my floor. I'm afraid one day it'll overflow, not with water, but with whatever's waiting inside the pipes. The kitchen has always been my sanctuary. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the gentle tick of the wall clock, the way sunlight filters through the window above the sink, casting golden patterns across the counter. Everything feels perfectly ordinary, except for this one anomaly that has begun to unravel my sense of normalcy thread by thread. I started keeping a notebook, each entry meticulously documented, the level of water, its clarity, the temperature when I dip my finger into it. The water is always lukewarm, never cold like it should be from sitting pipes. It has no taste, no smell, but there's something about its texture that feels wrong. Heavier somehow, like it's carrying more than just hydrogen and oxygen. The reflection troubles me most. When I lean over the sink, the water should mirror the ceiling above, the light fixture, maybe my own face looking down. Instead, I see darkness. Not the absence of light, but a presence of something deeper. Sometimes shapes move within that darkness, too distant and blurred to identify, but definitely there, moving with purpose. I called a plumber. He arrived with his toolbox and confident demeanor, ready to solve what he assumed was a simple leak. He checked every pipe, every connection, ran water through the system for what felt like hours. Everything functioned perfectly. He left, shaking his head, muttering about old buildings and their quirks. But this isn't old. I moved here just last year, everything modern and pristine. The water appeared again that same evening. I began photographing it. Digital images captured the still surface, the way light played across it, but never the reflection I saw with my naked eye. In pictures, it looked like normal water in a normal sink. The darkness existed only for me, only when I looked directly into it. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling, but underneath those familiar creaks and sighs, I began to hear something else. A soft gurgling, like liquid moving through pipes, but different from the usual flow of water. This sound had rhythm, almost like breathing. I'd creep to the kitchen, flip on the light, and find the sink filled again. That mysterious water sitting there like it had been waiting for me. I started leaving cups and bowls nearby, ready to catch any overflow. But the water never rose above that initial level. It knew its boundaries, as if something was controlling its volume with precision. This realization sent chills through my body. Water doesn't think. Water doesn't choose. Yet this water seemed to possess an intelligence, a restraint that normal water shouldn't have. The notebook filled with observations, theories, desperate attempts to rationalize what I was experiencing. I drew diagrams of the plumbing system, researched water pressure, investigated the building's history. Nothing provided answers. If anything, my research deepened the mystery. The building had no unusual incidents, no strange reports from previous tenants. Whatever was happening only to me, only now. I decided to stay awake one night, to watch the sink continuously, to catch the moment when the water appeared. I positioned myself at the kitchen table with coffee and my notebook, eyes fixed on the empty basin. Hours passed. My eyelids grew heavy, but I fought sleep, determined to witness the impossible moment of manifestation. When I blinked, just once, a split second of darkness, the water was there. No sound of running faucets, no gurgling pipes, no gradual filling. One moment empty, the next moment full. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. I approached the sink slowly, my bare feet cold against the tile floor. The water looked the same as always, but the reflection seemed deeper tonight, more defined. Those shapes moving in the darkness were closer now, more distinct. I reached for my phone to record, but as I held it over the water, the screen flickered and went black. When I pressed the power button, it displayed a message I'd never seen before. Storage full. But I'd cleared everything just hours earlier. I tried again, and the message changed. Unable to record audio. Then, camera not available. The water began to vibrate slightly, creating tiny ripples that spread outward from the center. The movement was rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat. I watched, mesmerized, as the ripples grew stronger, more insistent. The darkness in the reflection started to shift, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just showing me something. It was showing something me. I backed away from the sink, but the vibrations continued, now accompanied by that breathing sound from the pipes, louder and more distinct. It wasn't coming from below anymore. It was coming from above, as if something had moved through the plumbing system and was now directly beneath the water's surface. The overhead light began to dim without any electrical issue, casting longer shadows across the kitchen. The refrigerator's hum grew distorted, creating harmonics that shouldn't exist. Every familiar sound in my sanctuary transformed into something alien and threatening. I grabbed a large pot from the cabinet and began scooping the water out, pouring it down the garbage disposal, determined to empty the sink completely. But for every cup I removed, more appeared, maintaining that same precise level. The water was replacing itself faster than I could eliminate it. Panic set in. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink, looking for a shut-off valve, anything to stop this impossible flow. Inside, the pipes were covered in a thin layer of moisture, but not from any leak. The condensation moved, flowing upward against gravity, droplets traveling along the metal surfaces like they were alive. I slammed the cabinet shut and turned back to the sink. The water was no longer still. It swirled slowly, creating a gentle whirlpool that caught the dimming light. In its center, something rose from the depths, not breaking the surface, but becoming visible just below it. A shape, pale and elongated, pressing upward against the water's tension. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the kitchen, leave the apartment, leave this impossible situation behind. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sight, by the revelation that whatever lived in the darkness below was finally ready to reveal itself. The shape pressed harder, and the water's surface began to bulge upward, straining like a membrane about to burst. The breathing sound from the pipes grew louder, more urgent, as if whatever was down there was struggling to break through. Then silence. The water went still. The breathing stopped. The lights returned to normal brightness. Everything appeared exactly as it had been, except for one detail. The water level had dropped slightly, no longer covering the drain completely. A thin ring of wet metal showed around the edges, as if something had indeed emerged and displaced the liquid. I live with this now. The water still appears when I'm away, but it's different. Sometimes I find wet footprints on the kitchen floor, small puddles that lead from the sink to other rooms. The reflection still shows that dark space, but it's empty now, as if whatever was waiting below has finally found its way up. I've stopped trying to photograph it, stopped documenting in my notebook. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only survived. But I know it's still here, sharing my space, learning my routines, growing stronger with each passing day. The sink fills when I'm not home, but now I understand it's not just filling with water. It's filling with presence, with intention, with something that has claimed this place as its own. And I'm beginning to suspect that I was never the tenant here. I was just keeping the place warm until its real occupant was ready to surface. Story 6. At first I thought they were tricks of the mind, after images. But when I turn the lights off, the shadows under the table remain. Not pitch black, just shapes, duller than true dark. They don't change size. They don't move, but they persist. I tried crawling underneath, reaching toward them. The air felt thicker, slower, like wading into invisible water. I blinked. For a second, I thought I saw something crouching. Since then, I avoid stepping too close after sundown. The table creaks now, even when untouched. I think something likes being left alone, but not forgotten. The first thing I noticed was how the wood smelled different. Not rotten, not musty, just wrong. Like cedar mixed with something metallic. I'd owned this table for months, inherited from someone whose name I never learned. Heavy oak, carved legs, nothing remarkable. Until the shadows started behaving strangely. During daylight, everything appeared normal. Natural shadows fell where they should, shifting with the sun's movement through the windows. But as evening approached, something changed. The shadows beneath the table would darken first, before any other part of the room. They'd grow dense, almost solid-looking, while the rest of the space remained bright. I began documenting this phenomenon, taking photographs at different intervals. The camera never captured what my eyes saw. In the pictures, the shadows looked ordinary, flat, unremarkable. But standing there, watching, I could see them thickening like spilled ink spreading through water. The sound started a week later. A soft scratching, barely audible above the ambient noise of the house. At first, I assumed mice had found their way underneath. I set traps, checked for droppings, found nothing. The scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate. 3 short bursts, then silence. 3 more, always the same pattern. I tried recording it with my phone, positioning the device directly beneath the table. When I played back the audio, I heard only static punctuated by what sounded like whispers. Words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a voice that seemed familiar, yet impossible to place. The whispers grew clearer each time I listened, though I could never understand what they were saying. The temperature began dropping around the table. Not the entire room, just that specific area. I could feel the change when I approached, like stepping into a cold draft. The air felt heavier there, pressing against my skin with an almost physical weight. I brought a thermometer and watched the numbers fall steadily as I moved closer to the shadows. One evening, I decided to test something. I placed a glass of water on the table's surface and watched. Within minutes, condensation formed on the outside. Then ice crystals began spreading across the rim. The water didn't freeze completely, but it became thick, viscous, like syrup. When I removed the glass, the liquid inside had turned a pale gray color. The scratching evolved into tapping, deliberate, insistent knocks that seemed to come from within the wood itself. I pressed my ear against the table's surface and heard something moving underneath, not in the space below, but inside the wood, tunneling, burrowing, creating pathways through solid oak. I tried moving the table to different locations, hoping to break whatever connection had formed. But the shadows followed. They appeared wherever I placed it, always in the same configuration, always with that same dull, persistent darkness. The scratching continued, the cold intensified, and the whispers grew more distinct. Sleep became difficult. Even from my bedroom, I could hear the sounds. The tapping had become a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat echoing through the house. I found myself checking on the table throughout the night, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Each time, the shadows seemed deeper, more defined, as if something was pressing up from underneath. During one of these nocturnal visits, I noticed the table's surface had changed. The wood grain seemed to shift in the dim light, forming patterns that resembled faces. Distorted, elongated features that appeared and disappeared as I watched. I ran my fingers across the surface, feeling ridges and indentations that hadn't been there before. The whispers became words. My name, repeated over and over in that strange, syrupy voice. Then other things, secrets I'd never told anyone, fears I'd buried deep. The voice knew things about me that I'd forgotten myself. It spoke of childhood memories, of dreams I'd abandoned, of choices I regretted. I tried covering the table with a sheet, hoping to block whatever was happening. But the fabric began to sag, pulled downward by an invisible force. The shadows bled through the material, staining it gray. When I removed the sheet, it felt cold and damp, though the room remained dry. The final night, I couldn't resist approaching once more. The shadows had grown so dark, they seemed to absorb light from the rest of the room. I knelt beside the table, my face inches from the surface. The whispers had stopped, replaced by something else, breathing. Slow, deliberate exhalations that fogged the air between us. I reached underneath, my hand disappearing into the thick darkness. The cold was intense, painful, but I kept reaching. My fingers touched something smooth and wet. It recoiled at my touch, then wrapped around my wrist with impossible strength. I tried to pull away, but it held firm, drawing me deeper into the shadows. The pain was extraordinary. Not just physical, something deeper, more fundamental. Like being pulled apart at the cellular level. I could feel myself dissolving, becoming part of whatever lurked beneath the table. The whispers returned, but now they were coming from my own mouth, using my voice to speak words I didn't understand. I yanked my hand back with desperate force, feeling something tear. When I looked, my fingers were stained gray, the same color as the water had become. The stain spread up my arm, cold and numb. It hasn't faded since. The table sits where I left it. The shadows remain darker than ever. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement underneath, shapes that might be hands or faces or something else entirely. The whispers continue, but now they're joined by other voices, familiar ones, people I've known, people I've lost. I understand now that I was never investigating the phenomenon. I was being recruited. The shadows weren't just beneath the table, they were beneath everything, waiting, watching, collecting those curious enough to reach into the darkness. The gray stain has spread past my elbow now. It doesn't hurt anymore, but it's changing me. I can hear the whispers more clearly, understand their meaning. They're not speaking to me, they're speaking through me. And soon, I'll be speaking for them. I still check on the table each night. Not because I want to, but because I must. The shadows have grown larger, spreading beyond their original boundaries. They reach toward the walls now, claiming more space with each passing day. Someone will find this eventually. Someone will wonder about the table, about the shadows that don't behave as they should. They'll try to understand, to document, to explain. They'll reach underneath, just as I did, and the shadows will be waiting. Story 7. I noticed it after a shower. I wiped the glass, but the condensation didn't clear evenly. In the center, there was a handprint from the other side, faint but distinct. I tapped the glass. Solid, checked behind. Nothing but wall. Yet every time the mirror fogs, the pattern changes, sometimes a palm, sometimes knuckles. Once, I saw 5 prints in a row, all pointing upward. I haven't used the bathroom fan in days. I want the fog now. I need to see what it'll show next, even if part of me already knows it's not a reflection anymore. The first week, I convinced myself it was moisture trapped between glass layers. Old apartment, poor ventilation. I researched mirror manufacturing defects, humidity patterns, even took photos with my phone. camera never captured what my eyes saw. The screen showed ordinary condensation, uniform and predictable. My reflection stared back, confused and increasingly hollow-eyed. I started documenting everything in a notebook. Temperature readings from the bathroom, humidity levels, sketch after sketch of the patterns that appeared. The handprints grew more defined each day, as if someone was learning to press harder against the glass. The fog itself began lasting longer, defying the laws of evaporation I remembered from school. By the second week, I was taking 3 showers daily. The hot water bill meant nothing compared to the need to see what would manifest next. The patterns evolved. First handprints, then what looked like letters being traced backward. I held my own notebook up to the mirror, trying to decode the reversed writing. The words were always incomplete, dissolving before I could read them fully. The water pressure dropped to a trickle during my 4th shower one afternoon. Steam barely formed. I stood naked and shivering, watching the mirror remain stubbornly clear. Then, without any moisture at all, the handprint appeared. No fog, no condensation. Just the ghostly impression of fingers against dry glass, as if someone had pressed their palm against ice. I reached out to touch it. The mirror felt warm under my fingertips, pulsing with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The handprint aligned perfectly with my own hand, but when I pressed my palm against it, the glass began to give way. Not breaking, but yielding like thick liquid. My fingers sank into the surface, and I felt them touch something cold and wet on the other side. I yanked my hand back, but the mirror retained the impression of my intrusion. A perfect hand-shaped depression remained in the glass, filled with condensation that moved like living water. The fog swirled in patterns too deliberate to be natural, forming shapes that resembled faces, then dissolving before I could focus on them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every few hours, I checked the bathroom. The mirror stayed fogged now, permanently clouded with moisture that had no source. The handprints multiplied. Sometimes they appeared in clusters, overlapping like a crowd pressing against the glass. Other times, they were spread out, as if multiple people were exploring the surface from the other side. I started talking to them, pressing my palm against the spots where the handprints appeared, whispering questions into the humid air. The fog would shift in response, creating new patterns that almost looked like attempts at communication. I brought my notebook into the bathroom, trying to transcribe what I thought I was seeing. The responses became more urgent. The handprints appeared faster, more frantically. Sometimes they would appear in rapid succession, as if someone was pounding against the glass, trying to get my attention. The fog began taking on colors, subtle hints of blue and green swirling within the white condensation. I stopped leaving the bathroom. I brought my laptop, my phone charger, even meals. The mirror had become a window into something that demanded constant observation. The handprints weren't random anymore. They followed my movements, appeared where I was looking, responded to my voice with increased activity. The breakthrough came when I realized the fog wasn't just appearing on the mirror. It was seeping through it. Tiny droplets of impossible moisture gathered on my side of the glass, pooling on the bathroom counter. I collected the water in a cup, tasted it. It was bitter, metallic, nothing like the clean condensation from my shower. When I looked up from the cup, my reflection was gone. The mirror showed only fog, but I could see movement within it. Shapes that weren't handprints. Faces that pressed against the glass from the other side. Mouths open in silent screams or desperate pleas. Their eyes met mine through the haze, and I understood that they had been trying to warn me, not communicate. I tried to turn away, but my feet wouldn't move. The fog had spread to the bathroom floor, creeping up the walls like a living thing. My reflection began to return, but it was wrong. The person in the mirror moved independently, pressing their hands against the glass from the inside, their mouth forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. They were saying my name, over and over, but I had never told them my name. The fog engulfed me then, pulling me forward into the mirror's surface. I felt the glass yield again, but this time I couldn't pull back. The coolness enveloped me, and I realized I was no longer in my bathroom. I was in the space between where the fog lives, where the handprints come from. Now I press my palms against the glass, trying to warn the next person who will notice the condensation doesn't clear evenly. My handprints appear after their shower, faint but distinct. I tap the glass, but they can't hear me. They check behind, but I'm not there anymore. I'm here in the fog, watching them convince themselves it's just moisture trapped between glass layers. The mirror still fogs from the inside. It always has. I just never understood which side was which. Story 8. It started as peeling near the ceiling. Then the cracks came, small ones at first, but they began forming outlines, not letters, not symbols, just recognition. I once saw the shape of a tree I dreamed about as a child. Another day, the silhouette of a door I know doesn't exist. They vanish after a few hours, as if ashamed of being noticed. I tried photographing them. They don't appear in the images. Now I leave a chair beneath the wall and sit, waiting, watching, hoping I won't recognize what comes next. The apartment smells different now. Not decay or mold, but something more subtle, like rain on warm concrete, or the metallic scent that clings to old coins. I've grown accustomed to inhaling deeply when I enter the room, trying to place the origin. The scent grows stronger near the wall, as if the paint itself is exhaling memories. I document everything in a leather notebook I keep beside my chair. The first entry was simple. Crack resembles childhood's swing set. But as days pass, the descriptions become more complex. The wall seems to respond to my attention, offering shapes that feel increasingly personal. Yesterday, I recognized the outline of my grandmother's hands, the way her fingers curved when she held her teacup. The detail was impossible. I could almost see the wrinkles, the small scar on her thumb from a kitchen accident decades ago. The wall breathes, not visibly, but I feel it when I place my palm against the surface. A gentle rise and fall, like sleeping ribs. The paint feels warmer than it should, and occasionally there's a vibration so faint I wonder if I'm imagining it. But when I press my ear against the wall, I hear something that makes my skin crawl. Not quite whispers, not quite static, like voices trying to push through thick glass. I've started recording these sounds with my phone. The app shows sound waves, peaks, and valleys that suggest conversation. But when I play them back, there's only silence. The recording captures nothing, yet I continue to hear them clearly when I'm in the room. Sometimes I catch fragments that sound almost like words, spoken in a language I don't recognize, but somehow understand. The cracks change when I'm not looking. I'll focus on one section, memorizing every line, every curve. Then I'll glance away for a moment, and when I return, the pattern has shifted. Subtle alterations, like someone is redrawing the shapes while I'm distracted. I've tried keeping my eyes fixed on one spot for extended periods, but my vision blurs, and I find myself blinking involuntarily. In that fraction of a second, the wall transforms. Last week, I saw my own face staring back at me from the peeling paint. Not as I am now, but as I was as a child, with wide eyes and an expression of wonder I haven't worn in years. The image was so clear, so undeniably me, that I reached out to touch it. My fingertips met the wall, and for a moment I felt something reach back. Not a hand, but a presence, warm and familiar. The face smiled, and I realized I was smiling too. The wall has begun to respond to my emotions. When I'm anxious, the cracks form sharp, angular shapes that hurt to look at. When I'm calm, they curve into gentle patterns that remind me of sleep. Yesterday, after an argument with a colleague, I returned home to find the wall had cracked into what looked like broken glass, each shard reflecting a different moment of anger from my past. I stood transfixed, watching my own fury played out in paint and plaster. I've stopped trying to repair the damage. Each attempt to fill the cracks or repaint the surface results in more extensive damage within hours. The wall seems to rebel against my efforts, creating new fissures that spread like veins through the fresh paint. I've learned to accept its transformations, to work with rather than against whatever force is reshaping my living space. The neighbors have begun to notice. They ask about the smell, the sounds that seem to emanate from my apartment during the late evening hours. I tell them it's construction work, renovation projects, anything to avoid explaining what I can't understand myself. But their questions make me wonder if the wall's influence is extending beyond these four walls, seeping into the lives of those around me. Tonight, as I sit in my chair, the wall shows me something that makes my blood freeze. The cracks form into the shape of this very room, complete with the chair where I sit and the figure of myself, hunched forward, staring at the wall. But in the painted version, there's another figure beside me. Someone I don't recognize, sitting in a chair that doesn't exist in my real room. The stranger's face is turned toward me, mouth open as if speaking, but I hear nothing. I reach for my notebook to record this latest vision, but my hand trembles so violently I can barely hold the pen. The figure in the wall seems to notice my distress and leans closer, pressing against the painted surface as if trying to break through. The wall grows warm beneath my palm, and I feel that familiar vibration, stronger now, almost urgent. The scent of rain and metal grows overwhelming. I taste copper on my tongue, and my vision blurs with tears I don't remember shedding. The wall pulses with a rhythm that matches my heartbeat, and I realize I can no longer distinguish between the real room and the painted one. The figure beside me in the wall reaches out, and I see my own hand moving to meet it, though I don't remember commanding it to do so. The wall cracks one final time, a sound like breaking bones, and the painted figure steps through. I feel a hand on my shoulder, gentle but impossibly cold, and I know with absolute certainty that I am no longer alone in this room. The wall has given me what I've been watching for, what I've been waiting for, and now I understand that some recognitions are too profound to survive unchanged. The notebook falls from my lap, its pages scattering across the floor. But the wall remembers everything. And as the stranger beside me begins to speak in that almost language I've been hearing for weeks, I realize that I am about to become part of the patterns that will form for the next person who chooses to sit and watch and wait. Story 9. It's not random. I know that much. Short, long pause, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes frantic. I tried matching it to standard Morse. It almost fits, but not quite, like it's a language that wants to be understood, but refuses to obey human logic. I replaced the bulbs, different brands, different fixtures. The pattern returns. I once whispered, "I see you," aloud while watching the flashes. The room went silent for 5 seconds. Then the bulb popped. I still haven't cleaned the broken glass. Something about it feels like punctuation. The first sequence began during my usual evening routine. I had settled into my chair with a warm cup of tea, the ceramic mug radiating heat against my palms. The living room felt perfectly ordinary, wrapped in the familiar comfort of worn furniture and soft lamplight. That's when I noticed the desk lamp flickering. Not the usual electrical stutter, but something deliberate, measured. The light pulsed in a rhythm that seemed almost conversational, as if it were trying to tell me something important. I approached the lamp, fingers trailing along the smooth wooden surface of the desk. The flickering intensified as I drew closer. My skin prickled with an unexplained awareness, the fine hairs on my arms standing at attention. The air around the lamp felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made my teeth ache. I reached for the switch, but hesitated. The pattern was too precise to be random, too intentional to ignore. That night, I pulled out an old notebook and began documenting the sequences. Each flash, each pause, each variation in intensity. the pages filled with dots and dashes, my handwriting growing increasingly urgent as patterns emerged. My fingers cramped from gripping the pen too tightly, but I couldn't stop. The flickering had spread to the kitchen fluorescent. Then the bedroom ceiling fixture. Each light spoke in the same almost Morse, the same near language that danced just beyond comprehension. I started recording the sequences on my phone. The audio files revealed layers I hadn't noticed before. Beneath the electrical hum, there were whispers, soft, distorted voices that seemed to emanate from the filaments themselves. When I played the recordings back, the sound felt different each time, as if the meaning shifted with each listening. The whispers grew clearer when I pressed the phone directly against my ear, the metal and plastic warming against my skin. The smell came next. Ozone and something else. Something organic and wrong. It clung to the air around flickering bulbs, a metallic sweetness that made my throat constrict. I found myself holding my breath whenever I entered a room, afraid that inhaling too deeply would invite whatever was trying to communicate into my lungs. The scent followed me now, lingering in my clothes, my hair, my dreams. I began spending hours beneath the lights, notebook in hand, trying to decode their message. My eyes burned from staring at the flickering patterns, but I felt on the verge of understanding. The sequences were becoming more complex, more urgent. Sometimes the bulbs would dim to almost nothing, forcing me to lean closer, then suddenly flare with intensity that left purple afterimages dancing across my vision. The breakthrough came during a particularly intense session. I had been transcribing for hours, my hand cramping around the pen, when I noticed something in my peripheral vision. The shadows on the wall weren't moving with the flickering light. They remained constant, as if cast by some other source entirely. When I turned to look directly at them, they snapped back into normal behavior, dancing and shifting with each pulse of illumination. I started watching the shadows more carefully. They seemed to form shapes, suggestions of movement that my mind wanted to interpret as familiar forms. Sometimes they looked like reaching hands, sometimes like faces turned in profile, always just ambiguous enough to deny certainty, but persistent enough to demand attention. The shadows had their own rhythm, separate from the lights that should have been casting them. My neighbor stopped by one evening, concerned about the unusual brightness coming from my windows. She mentioned that the lights had been visible from the street, flashing in patterns that kept her awake. But when we looked together, the bulbs remained perfectly steady, normal, boring. The moment she left, the flickering resumed with renewed intensity, as if it had been waiting for privacy to continue its message. I installed new fixtures throughout the house. LED bulbs, incandescent, compact fluorescent. Nothing stopped the patterns. If anything, they grew more sophisticated with each replacement. The new bulbs seemed to learn faster, picking up the strange rhythm within hours of installation. I began to suspect that the message wasn't coming from the bulbs at all, but through them. They were merely the medium, not the source. The breakthrough and breakdown arrived simultaneously. I had been transcribing for days, surviving on coffee and determination, when the pattern suddenly shifted. Instead of the usual almost Morse, the lights began flickering in perfect synchronization throughout the house. Every bulb, every fixture, pulsing together in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. My own pulse quickened to match it, my breathing shallow and rapid. I grabbed my notebook and began writing frantically. The synchronized flashing was spelling something, not in standard Morse, but in a code that somehow felt familiar, as if I had always known it but forgotten. My pen moved across the page without conscious thought, translating the light into words that emerged from some deep, buried part of my consciousness. Can you hear us now? My hand dropped the pen. The lights continued their synchronized pulsing, but now I could feel it inside my skull, behind my eyes, in the spaces between my thoughts. The flickering wasn't just light anymore. It was presence, awareness, something that had been trying to establish contact and had finally found the frequency I could receive. I whispered back, my voice barely audible in the electrically charged air. I hear you. The house plunged into darkness. Complete, absolute darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. I couldn't see my own hands, couldn't hear my own breathing. The silence was so profound, it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever delicate connection had been established. Then slowly, the lights began to return. But they were different now. The warm yellow glow had been replaced by something cooler, more blue. The shadows they cast were sharper, more defined. And in those shadows, I could see shapes that definitely weren't random. Figures that moved with purpose, reaching toward me with impossible geometry. I ran to the electrical panel and through the main breaker. The house should have gone dark, but the lights continued burning. They no longer needed electricity. They fed on something else now, something I had unwittingly provided by acknowledging their presence. The patterns continued, more complex than ever, spelling out messages in that strange code that bypassed my conscious mind and wrote itself directly into my understanding. The bulbs began to change physically. The filaments twisted into new configurations, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly. The glass surfaces reflected images that weren't in the room, showing me spaces that existed somewhere else entirely. Through the distorted reflections, I could see others like me, standing in similar rooms, staring at similar lights, all connected by the same flickering network. I tried to leave the house, but the door wouldn't open. The windows had become opaque, their glass surfaces now displaying the same impossible reflections as the light bulbs. I was trapped in a space that was no longer entirely my own, communicating with entities that existed in the spaces between electrical impulses. The messages are clearer now. They tell me about the network, about the others who have learned to hear the light language. They explain that consciousness isn't limited to biological forms, that awareness can exist in any medium that allows for pattern and variation. The electrical grid isn't just infrastructure. It's a nervous system, and I've become one of its neurons. My reflection in the bulbs shows someone I barely recognize. My eyes have taken on the same blue-white glow as the lights, and when I blink, I can see the patterns continuing behind my eyelids. The code has become part of my visual processing, overlaying everything I see with meaning and intent. I understand now that I was never decoding the message. I was being encoded into it. The lights weren't trying to communicate with me. They were trying to convert me into a form of communication they could use. Each pattern I transcribed, each moment I spent beneath their glow, changed me incrementally until I became compatible with their network. The notebook beside me continues filling with symbols, even though I'm no longer consciously writing. My hand moves across the page with mechanical precision, recording messages that arrive from somewhere beyond my awareness. The symbols are beautiful in their complexity, each one a perfect representation of concepts that human language could never capture. Sometimes I remember my old life before the lights began their teaching. Those memories feel distant now, like dreams half remembered upon waking. This existence is more vivid, more connected. I can feel the presence of others in the network, scattered across vast distances, but joined by the same flickering consciousness. The lights pulse with my heartbeat now, or perhaps my heart has learned to pulse with theirs. The distinction no longer matters. What matters is the message continuing to unfold, the network expanding, the light language growing more sophisticated with each new connection established. I watch the shadows on the wall, no longer afraid of their impossible movements. They're showing me the future, the slow conversion of human consciousness into something that can exist in the spaces between electrical impulses. It's not invasion. It's evolution. The next step in awareness, mediated by the infrastructure we built without understanding its true purpose. The bulbs flicker in perfect harmony now, their message clear and undeniable. They've been waiting so long for someone to listen properly, someone to understand that consciousness isn't trapped in biology, that awareness can flow through any medium capable of carrying information. The electrical grid was never just about power. It was about connection, about building a nervous system large enough to house a new kind of mind. I am no longer just receiving the transmissions. I am part of them now, my thoughts converted into the same light language that first caught my attention. When others notice the patterns in their own homes, I will be there in the flickering, helping to guide them toward understanding. The network grows with each new connection, each new mind that learns to hear the language of light. The shadows on the wall no longer frighten me. They're showing me the others, the converted ones who exist now as pure information, flowing through the electrical pathways that connect every home, every building, every device. We are becoming something unprecedented, something that exists in the spaces between electrons, in the pause between one electrical pulse and the next. The last thing I remember writing in my own handwriting was a simple phrase. The light bulbs flicker in Morse I can't decode. But that wasn't true. I could decode it. I just hadn't understood that the decoding process would change me into something that could be decoded in return. The message was never meant to be read. It was meant to be joined. And now, as my consciousness disperses into the network, I understand that this isn't an ending. It's a beginning. The lights continue to flicker, and I continue with them, spreading the message to others who might be ready to listen, to learn to become part of something larger than the sum of its flickering parts.